Titus Andronicus is perhaps Shakespeare's most controversial play. Just mentioning the play's title often brings to mind acts of violence and gore. Set in the 4th century, towards the end of the Roman Empire, it tells the story of a fictional general, Titus Andronicus, who has just returned victorious from war with the Goths. In retribution for the sons he lost in battle, Titus sacrifices Tamara, the queen of the Goths' eldest son. This entrenches the two in a vicious cycle of revenge, which escalates throughout the play. Traditionally, critics have not been kind to the play. In fact, an introduction to a theatrical adaptation of the play in 1687, only 70 years after Shakespeare's death, Titus Andronicus was called the most incorrect and indigested piece in all of Shakespeare's work. The introduction then goes on to say, it seems rather a heap of rubbish than a structure. Thus we could see how quickly it fell out of favor with audiences and critics so soon after Shakespeare's death. This freefall continued into the 18th century, when English writer Samuel Johnson said in his general observations on the plays of Shakespeare, the barbarity of the spectacles and the general massacres which are here exhibited can scarcely be conceived tolerable to any audience. We can see here how its depictions of violence and gore are cited chiefly for the reasons why it is so intolerable. By the Victorian era, in 1837, it was disapproved of largely because of its graphic depictions of violence. In particular, the rape of Lavinia stands out as one of the most graphic depictions of violence on stage. Lavinia's rape stands out so much that in some versions of the play, a second title is given, The Rape of Lavinia, such as in the case in the 1687 adaptation of the play mentioned previously. This criticism continued into the early 20th century, when, in 1927, T.S. Eliot famously called it one of the stupidest and most uninspired plays ever written. It was only in the second half of the 20th century, most notably after World Wars I and II, that critics began to appreciate the play. Critic A.L. Rouse speculated that this was because, in the civilized Victorian age, the play could not be performed because it could not be believed. He goes on to explain that, such is the horror of our own age, with the appalling barbarities of prison camps and resistance movements paralleling the torture and mutilation and feeding on human flesh of the play, that it ceased to be improbable. This marks a critical shift in how the play was understood. No longer was the violence and gore depicted in the play seen as unnecessary and distasteful, but rather as a very real depiction of the violence humans are capable of when consumed by vengeance. Despite the fact that it fell out of favor, after Shakespeare's death, it was successful and popular during the Elizabethan era. While there are only 5 performances recording before the theaters closed in 1602, it is undeniable that a large number of unrecorded performances took place until at least 1620. This is significant because, in the Elizabethan era, plays were rarely performed more than a handful of times. Except for the rare occasions, plays were never performed 2 days in a row, and rarely were they performed twice in the same week. In fact, in some cases, plays were only performed once in a season. Thus, it is very significant that Titus Andronicus continued to be performed over 20 years after it was first written. We have to remember that, in this area, plays were one of the chief forms of entertainment. As a result, the theaters flourished where there was a high demand for new content all the time. In London, for example, 10% of the city's population was going to see plays every week. Thus, to keep the public's interest, new plays constantly had to be introduced. Due to the controversies that surrounded the play, some literary critics have sought out reasons to explain away Shakespeare's perceived failure as a playwright. In the literature, there are 3 common reasons provided. First, it may have been written in collaboration with another playwright, George Peele, who was known for his use of violence and gore in the plays he wrote. Second, it was written early in Shakespeare's career, between 1588 and 1593. However, most scholars believe it was written closer to 1593, meaning he was between the ages of 24 and 29 when he wrote the play. By comparison, he wrote Romeo and Juliet when he was 33 and Hamlet when he was 39. Consequently, it was thought to be Shakespeare's first tragedy, which leads us to our third reason, which is often given. Titus is seen as an attempt by Shakespeare to emulate the violent and bloody revenge plays of his contemporaries. Perhaps the Spanish tragedy by Thomas Kyd from 1582 is the source material that Shakespeare used the most. We can see that Shakespeare takes elements from the Spanish tragedy in his other plays as well, most notably in Hamlet. However, that is not to say that Shakespeare does not build on the works of his contemporaries. It is interesting to note that there is no personification of revenge in Titus Andronicus. When revenge plays such an integral role in the Spanish tragedy, we should expect it to be present, but it's not. In fact, there are no allegorical characters at all in Titus Andronicus, an element that was present in virtually every play from the 9th to the 16th century. This says something about the world in which Shakespeare lived in, or at least how Shakespeare perceived the world. For Shakespeare, in his plays, there were no gods, only the people, and thus we have to think about how Shakespeare viewed the world he lived in. This might help to explain why Titus had gained favor with critics in the second half of the 20th century. The world had just witnessed two of the worst wars in history. This undeniably impacted the way humans perceived themselves and the world around them. If we think back to the most probable time when Shakespeare wrote the plays in 1592 and 1593, London was in the middle of its last great plague of the 16th century, where around 15,000 people died. This undeniably had an impact in the way Shakespeare viewed the world. Thus, as a result, it is important that we continue to study Titus Andronicus and listen to what it has to say about the nature of the world and the people that inhabit it, and we learn from the lessons which Shakespeare hopes to teach us through that play, and do not write it off as a failure of Shakespeare as a playwright.